Nicholson, did you sort of take advantage of things that you knew about him personally in order to get things out of him that maybe other writers and directors couldn't?
Well, of course. I mean, look, I was in acting class with Jack for 7 or 8 years, and I had the opportunity to watch him improvise a couple of times a week. So I knew a lot of things about him that I was able to, in the best sense of the word, exploit when I was working on the script.
What were some of the things that you noticed in his personality that you put in to get us?
Well, there were many of them, but I mean, his capacity for indignation is wonderful to take advantage of, because he's very funny.
Well, something that's great about that character in this movie is that, as far as I can tell, you never leave his point of view. Basically, every scene in this movie is from Giddis's point of view. Was that difficult to be that rigorous? Were you ever tempted to cheat and go away from his point of view in order to get information across?
It was difficult, and we were aware of the fact that we were holding strictly from his point of view. And as far as I know, I don't know any other major detective movie where that doesn't happen, or that does happen. Yes, it is difficult because you got nothing to cut away to. I mean, that's your guy.
Yeah, and the movie plays with the whole private detective archetype in a lot of really interesting ways, because you're kind of riffing on Raymond Chandler and Philip Marlowe, but then you also push against the old traditions. For example, in like a lot of the old detective novels, it's always taken as a point of the detective's integrity that he won't take divorce work. And in this movie, it's the opening scene, Giddis is doing divorce work. So was that something that, were you consciously trying to play against the formula, or?
Yeah, yes. I mean, Philip Marlowe was sort of a tarnished knight, but a knight nevertheless, and wouldn't stoop to divorce work or anything like that. That's where they made their money. So one of the first things that I did was make sure that Giddis was going to be well dressed and do divorce work. Which is where we make money. And I interviewed a number of at that time private detectives who. There was a famous one some years ago called Freddie Otage. And just listening to them talk about it. Yeah.
Well, aside from you and Nicholson, obviously the key player in this movie is Polanski. What was your relationship like with him? Had the script been locked down before he came on board, or did you guys work together a lot on rewriting it?
No, it hadn't been locked down. I had written actually a couple of drafts of it, and then he came aboard. I mean, came out to Southern California, and we sat down for about 6 weeks and reworked the script. It was very productive, very contentious, and a lot of fun. Roman is a lot of fun.
I want to give the audience a chance to ask a few questions, but before I do, I have a question for you guys. How many people here have never seen Chinatown? Okay, so try to stay away from questions, as much as you might want to ask questions about the ending or things like that. Try to stay away from questions that give stuff away for people who have never seen the movie. It's actually really exciting that there's so many people here who have never seen it. So, any questions? Yeah, all the way up in the back.
Yeah, can you speak about the planned trilogy of Chinatown?
The question is about the planned trilogy.
I don't know where that got started. I did a second version of it, but neither it nor the movie turned out well, and I was never going to contemplate a third, although
All right. Other questions? I'll repeat the question. Why did you make it noir? Oh, okay. He was asking about the historical events that actually inspired the movie and why you decided to do it as a noir as opposed to a Western.
Well, I don't know what to say. There was no L.A. If it had been a Western. I wanted to tell a story that took place in Los Angeles in the 30s, when it was there. I don't know what else to tell you.
When did you first become aware of the real story behind it? When did you become aware of the whole water wars and all that?
Well, there were a number of occasions that brought it home to me. There was but I think I really started learning about it when I was in Oregon and I was working with Jack on a movie that he did. And I came up there and I was in it, but it didn't really count. And I came across a book in the library there called Southern California Country, An Island on the Land. And it's a book by Carrie McWilliams. I don't know if many of you know of Carrie, but he was a wonderful man and an absolutely gorgeous writer about Southern California. That book is still to this day probably the single best volume. I don't know if you know it. The single best volume on Southern California that anybody ever wrote. And it's still, written in 1945, it's still relevant today. Anyway, I became fascinated, and the only thing that I did was telescope what I took to be the events that really started in 1900, 1, 2, 3, and moved it into the 30s and moved it into a much briefer period of time.
Yeah, on the other side.
Can I ask you, was there a lot of pressure, like maybe towards the end, especially from the production company, to cut it short or cut some parts out or wrap it up, or you're spending too much money? Or did you have free reign all the way through the making of or did they, and did you work with them throughout?
Yes. Bob Evans was the producer of the movie, and he was the head of Paramount. So we didn't have a lot of pressure from anyone, except the fact that nobody at the studio, there weren't a lot of people who felt that they understood the movie. Least of all was Bob. Bob said, I didn't understand a goddamn thing about it, but I like the title. That's how that happened. But no, we didn't have... There wasn't that kind of interference that there is today. I'm not quite sure why. Well, yes, I am, but it's a long story.
Was Hopwell fiction of, say, Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler, was it an integral influence on your script, or is that just a circumstantial parallel of writing about a private detective?
I'll repeat the question so everybody in the balcony can hear. The question was about the influences. Were Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and people like that influences on you?
Well, yes, they were influences, but they were influences, I mean, Raymond Chandler's character was, almost the mirror image opposite of Gittes. Kind of honorable, but poor, but, I mean, Gittes was none of those things. Gittes had a certain hidden streak of idealism, romanticism in himself, but he was out for himself. And Chandler was not that way. Hammett was a different character, and except for the hard-boiled aspect of it, he was not as much of an influence. I mean, Chandler was a real influence, if for no other reason than his love of Southern California.